All right, welcome to You Don't Know Ball. Today, we're with Jordan from Generation Jaguar. We're going to be talking about the offseason that the Jaguars have had and the general vibe coming for the 2024 season. As always, if you don't know ball and want to know ball, be sure to subscribe. Leave a like. Let us know in the comments what you think the Jaguars' record will be this year. So, Jordan, we'll just start off kind of chronologically here. What was your favorite move from free agency that the Jaguars made?
Great question. There's really two, one on each side of the ball. I think we're just massive. I think you got to start with Mitch Morse, the Buffalo center coming over. And every time you talk about, well, why is a free agent available? He was available because the Bills had to shed a ton of cap this offseason, as with a bunch of other former Bills. But Luke Fortner, you know, as much as you respect every pro, he really struggled at center for the Jaguars in 2023. Was one of the worst starting centers in the league in a variety of ways. And Mitch Morse, the level of stability, leadership, and athleticism that he brings to the center position, which is vital for an offensive success, I think is huge. And then on the defensive side of the ball, adding a player like Eric Armstead to pair with Josh Allen and Trayvon Walker and the rest of the guys they have up front, I thought was massive. Again, from a leadership standpoint, production, and a guy who gets the job done in the biggest games. So I thought those were the two biggest free agent moves that they made, pretty easily.
Yeah, I know. Definitely upgrade at center play is a huge thing, and me and Dobbs talk about it a lot. It's kind of underrated in terms of what you look for on an offensive line. Just being a Bears fan, watching horrendous center play over the last couple of years has really hindered, the offensive line and what it truly can be. And also, to your point, adding a guy like Eric Armstead, when you have Trayvon Walker, when you have Josh Allen, it just adds another layer of versatility to that defensive line. And I think, especially with how competitive the division has gotten, you have to kind of take those swings. And I guess my question based off that is, when you lose a guy like Calvin Ridley, you add Brian Thomas Jr., you add Gabe Davis, how much faith do you have in the new look receiving core?
Well, that's a great question. I think I have a lot of confidence in what Gabe Davis is. That's not like a wide receiver one, but as a contributor on an offense who doesn't drop the football a lot. Most of the times when he's targeted, he's picking up first downs or touchdowns. When you look at statistically, he's a vertical threat, and he does the dirty work. Like, this is a guy that's going to block his ass off. He's going to, I mean, you can put him in the box, like you can put him next to the line of scrimmage as basically like an H back or tight end, and he's going to get the job done. So there's a lot of versatility in what he brings. Obviously, not a one-to-one comparison with Calvin Ridley from a skill set standpoint. But Brian Thomas Jr., I think the hope is that he will be that explosive, speed threat that they hoped Calvin Ridley would be. And Ridley, he had ups and downs with the Jags last year in 2023, dropped a fair amount of footballs, was in the wrong place at the wrong time at times. But on the reverse side of that coin, he also put up over 1,000 yards and scored 8 touchdowns in his first year back from not playing football for almost 2 years. So I do think the Jaguars wanted to keep Calvin Ridley. I think they thought they were going to keep Calvin Ridley until the Titans swooped in at the last minute with that mega deal, and kind of took the wind out of their sails. And then so they had to pivot. I think they wanted to draft a cornerback in the first round because they didn't get Calvin Ridley and they knew they wanted to have somebody with a wide receiver one type profile. That's why they went Brian Thomas Jr. in the first round. I think they're happy they did, but I've kind of made this comparison a couple times recently. Would you rather have Calvin Ridley and Terrion Arnold or Brian Thomas Jr. and Jarian Jones, who you drafted in the third round, right? As your, like, that's what you would have had if you were able to keep Calvin Ridley. So I think it's interesting for the Jaguars. I certainly like Brian Thomas Jr. and Jarian Jones. I think they did a good job overall at wide receiver and corner, but I think you could have felt like you had a more complete and more ready to go group with Calvin and Terrion Arnold, certainly.
See, and no, and Jordan, I completely agree with what you're saying, but just to flip it also in a more positive light for like, today's landscape with how contracts are getting paid out. In a sense, we could say, well, did Calvin Ridley already kind of hit the ceiling of his career and will he ever get back to that, the pre-gambling days? And like you said, that Titans contract that they paid out it's not any slight money. That's a lot of money. So now you get a guy that could potentially end up rounding out to an even higher ceiling where you're paying him way less. And then now you have a lot more money to kind of move around in other areas. So I agree with your initial analogy. Don't get me wrong. You'd rather have right now this season, Calvin and Terrion. But down the road, I think it could almost end up being a blessing in disguise where you're paying Brian Thomas minimal money for the position he plays right now. And if he can end up being that dominant X receiver for you guys, all of a sudden that, you have a lot of cap in good areas versus if it was all just, not all, but a lot of it invested in Calvin Ridley instead. So it's just a more positive way to look at it too.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree that long term, the Brian Thomas Jr. move could be everything you want because the Jaguars, they haven't drafted a receiver since Trevor Lawrence has been here that really has that wide receiver one type of potential. Every receiver they had, they've been paid. They went out and paid Christian Kirk in free agency. They went out and paid Gabe Davis this year. Calvin Ridley, they were going to have to pay this year. And so everyone that they've had has been a veteran. They haven't had any homegrown, young, inexpensive, talented wide receivers for the most part. So, yeah, it could absolutely play out to be beneficial long-term for the Jaguars. I still think when you look at a team that's trying to compete for a championship, trying to compete for a division title, they wanted to retain Calvin Ridley and draft him. That's not what ended up happening.
No, and that makes sense. That makes sense. And I think this is a perfect transition to one of the next questions I had for you here, Jordan. And I think it's a good one. I'm curious for your answer because the Jaguars certainly had, I'm sure you would agree, one of the more interesting draft classes of anybody this year. So besides Brian Thomas Jr., who would you say was the favorite draft pick that you guys made?
That's a good question as well. I really was a big fan of Jarian Jones at Florida State coming out. They think he can play outside and play nickel. He played better in his college days when he was at nickel, but he's got tremendous speed. I think probably the best value, honestly, was probably Javon Foster in the 4th round, the offensive tackle out of Missouri, who's got length. He's got short area explosiveness, a ton of experience, leadership. I think that he's going to end up probably being the steal of the draft, but I loved the process during the draft of trading down from 17 to 23 and then still getting that receiver that you were coveting at that point because you're able to pick up a 3rd, a 4th, and a 5th round pick, 4th and 5th this year, 3rd next year to move down 6 spots. And I think the Vikings were pretty fairly criticized by most for that move. Obviously, Dallas Turner's a good fit with the Vikings from a schematic standpoint, talent standpoint, but they gave up a king's ransom to not only to get to 23, they gave up 2 second-round picks to get to 23. And then from 23 to move up to 17, they gave up another 3rd, 4th, and 5th. So you're talking about moving 2 seconds, a 3rd, a 4th, and a 5th to get up to 17 overall in the draft.
No, yeah, and well, to that point, just a little side note, it's not like the Vikings, at least in my opinion, are like, 1 or 2 players away from competing for the Lombardi. It's like you still have a fair amount of roster building. Yeah, you have some good pieces, but that's like a home run. We're literally a player away type move. So yeah, to your point, I think long term from that trade, even though initially it was like, oh, why were the Jaguars? Some people were like, why would they trade now? Why just take the guy? I think to your point, long term, I think the history will look back on this and say that the Jaguars were actually on the right side of it. Because if the Vikings don't make a miraculous run at the Lombardi in the next, 2 or 3 years at this point, with that lack of capital, we're going to start asking a lot of questions about that move.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that they maybe were hoping to get some compensation from the Kirk Cousins deal, but I think with the way they signed players, they're not going to be able to. So when you talk about the comp pick formula,
no, and that's kind of sticking on the topic of GMs. I know if Dallas Turner ends up being the player you think he can be, and JJ McCarthy ends up being the player you could think he could be, even though they didn't necessarily trade that much for him. But if you want to put in the process of, well, they thought they were going to have to trade up, that's why they got the second first this year, and they're like, okay, maybe we have the picks, let's just go spend them. I think they gave up a lot to get those two players. But sticking on the topic of GMs, I know the last couple years, the vibe has been kind of up and down on Trent Baalke. What is, kind of the expectation or feeling about him going into this year? And is it really dependent on how the roster performs, how the teams perform this year? Because I know there was some questions about even the offense last year and how that worked.
Yeah, well, obviously the NFL is a results business. So yes, it's going to, what happens with the Jaguars in 2023 and beyond is going to matter. If they don't make the playoffs, I have to feel that he's probably, handled his last offseason for the Jaguars. But overall, I think when you look at the results of this offseason, you can feel pretty good about a lot of the things that happened. They improved on the trenches. They got their wide receiver one of the future. I think that he did a pretty good job overall, again, results-wise this offseason. But I still think that one thing I've harped on throughout his tenure in Jacksonville, a lot of times he ends up having decent results, but I don't agree with the process of how things go down. Like having to place the franchise tag on Josh Allen meant that you couldn't place the franchise tag on Calvin Ridley. If you had just gotten the Josh Allen deal done earlier and then placed the franchise tag on Calvin Ridley, he's still in Jacksonville. And that's what they wanted all along. They wanted him to remain in Jacksonville. So I just think that even though you look at this roster, it looks pretty good overall. I don't think that the process is always great. And I do still question what their plan is overall at corner. They do have Ronald Darby and Tyson Campbell who are going to be starters at this point. But do you feel really comfortable enough in an AFC that is just loaded with quarterback play, wide receiver play, talented offenses that you're really going to be able to keep up? It's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. That's the one area right now where I would really question what they've done so far. And then also edge depth. You have to have a good rotation at edge. You have Josh Allen and Trayvon Walker, who are both fantastic. But beyond that, not a lot of proven talent.
No, yeah. We've said, just like to echo your sentiment 100%, it's kind of like with Baalke, there's some good, but then there's also some moments where you're kind of just scratching your head. But to your point, look, the reality of the situation is he's put back together, and again, not that they weren't last year, but it was just an odd year last year. He's put together a competitive roster for you guys. You guys definitely, move some pieces, figured out some things this offseason. It's really just a matter of the results, like you're saying, because it's a result-based business. But it will be interesting to see because, to your point, if they don't make the playoffs, I think there will be a fair amount for sure, and that's being generous, a fair amount of change in just the front office and just the staff in general. So it's definitely a very big make or break year for not only him, but just the staff in general at this point.
Yeah, 100%. I think that it would surprise me if Doug didn't survive, Doug Peterson, the head coach. But yeah, I can't see the Jaguars missing the playoffs 2 years in a row with the group that they have and things, kind of staying the course.
No, and I would agree with that as well. I definitely agree. I expect to see you guys in the playoffs this year for sure.
So let me ask you this. Because of the addition of Eric Armstead, do you think this is going to add a significant boost to the defensive line, a big difference? Because I know he is a little bit older, but he still has some juice.
Yeah, so he's been one of the most productive interior pass rushers in the league when that's been his role. The 49ers throughout his time there have kind of mixed up what his role has been throughout his career. But yeah, when he's been asked to just be that interior disruptor in clear pass rushing situations, he's been fantastic in that role. I think that's what the Jaguars are going to ask him to do here. And playing with Josh Allen and Trayvon Walker, it's going to make his job easier. It's going to make their jobs easier. And one thing, an underrated storyline, certainly nationally, but even in Jacksonville, Devon Hamilton, their other starting defensive tackle, he had a health issue that popped up in the preseason of 2023, really kind of forced him to not be the player he was last year, missed the first half of the season, and then just wasn't fully healthy last year. So he's supposed to be fully healthy. If he can be the player that he was in 2022, and then the player that you saw throughout the offseason and training camp and preseason in 2023, that's going to be an extremely formidable starting front for the Jacksonville Jaguars because he was wreaking havoc. He's the biggest defensive lineman they have. So that could be an underrated storyline that if he's fully healthy, the Jaguars defensive front could cause problems for pretty much every team they play.
No, and it's a great point you're making, because I was going to ask you here a question about, who needs to step up most on this D line this season. But I feel like that kind of answers the question. If Devon Hamilton can come in and, right, like you said, be that same player from 2022, I think that's probably is the guy you need to step up most, because to your point, Armstead, Walker, and Allen, you had some very, very formidable trio now. And if you could put 4 guys on a line that are constantly disrupting, making it rough for the O-line, yeah, all of a sudden that D line's really coming together. Question I wanted to ask that's definitely interesting while we're sticking on the topic of defense here. Because, and again, as you know, these things can change. We're still very early in the offseason process. It's all this stuff is subject to change at this point. But, Antonio Johnson played very limited snaps for you guys last season, but he's currently listed as your guys' starting strong safety on the depth chart. Meanwhile, Darnell Savage, who you guys signed as a free agent, is actually listed as a slot cornerback, even though he's been primarily safety in the NFL. Back in Maryland, he used to play slot corner, though, in college. Are you confident in, number one, how confident are you in Antonio Johnson getting the full-time safety role? But then on top of that, how confident are you on Darnell Savage making that transition back to slot for you guys? Because he did play about 100, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 108 snaps last year at slot for the Packers. But again, that's not a very big sample size or anything. So how confident are you in both of those, the starting Antonio and then also Darnell in the slot?
Yeah, so I thought as soon as we saw Antonio Johnson on the field last offseason, I was like, this is definitely Rayshawn Jenkins last year in Jacksonville. Because he just has it. Like, he looks like a starter in the NFL. You saw that at Texas A&M, where he was an enforcer, a guy who did play a lot of nickel, but the way Texas A&M had their nickel aligned, it was really more of off coverage, like 10 yards off, more like a safety, really. He wasn't like running man coverage and covering these elite movers in the slot or anything like that. So, yeah, I think having him as your strong safety makes sense. I think that Darnell Savage, from a fluidity, athleticism, like the ability to stick with a receiver in man coverage perspective, yeah, like I think he can get the job done at nickel. I think there's been questions about his consistency. I think the less you ask him to do from a mental standpoint, the better results you're going to get if you're just allowing him to go out there and play man coverage. And so I think that's what the Jaguars will ask him to do. But I think you'll see these guys move around. Like Antonio Johnson last year when he did play nickel, it was really a big nickel role. He would be out there like in running situations when they're trying to stop the run. Again, not necessarily to go out there and cover these quick slot receivers in the NFL. So I feel pretty decent about it. Jarian Jones, who they drafted in the 3rd round, could also compete at nickel. Depending on how things go for Darnell Savage, I think Jarian Jones could certainly fill that role as well.
No, that's a great point about Jarian, because he was one of my guys kind of early on in this process here. I was like, I didn't know where he was going to end up going in the draft, but I was like, this is a guy who both Florida State, starting corners. I was like, Florida State's got some dogs that kind of just not slipped through the cracks, but they had so many good players. It was kind of like it was hard to narrow down on just one of them. But yeah, to your point, I think you look at it on paper and you're like, maybe, how much faith do you have in the Jaguars, DB depth? But then when you really think about it, to your point, you got a lot of options, a lot of versatility. So even if one thing doesn't work at one spot, you definitely have a lot of room to rotate and kind of just figure out where it works best.
Yeah, I agree with that. If Ronald Darby goes down, which, throughout his career, he's been plagued with injuries. If you have him go down, you're now talking about either Jarian Jones going out there and trying to play outside, Buster Brown, who does have experience, but let's face it, he's not the best athlete in the world, and that's why he got drafted in the 7th round. Another rookie in DeAndre Prince, who's another speedy guy out of Ole Miss, I liked his tape as well. But again, if you had one more veteran in that cornerback room to play outside, I think you'd feel a lot better. But I agree. there is the possibility, maybe even the probability, that they have enough options to where they can make it work in this new Ryan Nielsen defense, even if there is an injury sustained on the outside at quarterback. So I agree with you to an extent. If it was me, though, just like you're not all in on 2024. Like, it doesn't have to be a make or break year necessarily, but you have to make the playoffs. Like, you don't have to win the Super Bowl. You don't have to go to the AFC Championship, but you have to have a much better season than you did last year. And so I'd be with the amount of salary cap space that they have, I would be a little bit more aggressive with making sure the most important positions had better depth.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my thing too is like they could always be a player in the late, free agency market and add someone getting closer to the season. Now, kind of talking about like the salary cap and everything like that, Trevor Lawrence, he's on the verge of potentially getting a new contract, an extension, everything like that. And I guess from an optics standpoint, kind of the general consensus for some reason has soured not a ton, but a little bit on like Trevor Lawrence and everything like that. Like, I still think he's going to be a really good player. I mean, he's never had a season where he's had less than 3,600 yards. He had 4,000 yard seasons the last 2 years. While he did have a 21 touchdowns, 14 interceptions, not a great ratio, but I think that can be attributed to a lot of things. I think you have more vertical receivers now, and that adds just a different element to the Jaguars offense. Realistically, not much of a bounce back season, but do you think Trevor Lawrence can kind of raise the ceiling from what he had in 2022?
Yeah, well, certainly, yes, I do. There's a lot. Quarterback is such an interesting thing to talk about, especially in the NFL, because people will bring up the fact that like Daniel Jones and Trevor Lawrence's stats are identical, right? But it's like, you don't know ball, right?
Right. Yeah.
So Trevor Lawrence was playing through injury in the back half of last year. He was gutting it out. He had like 4 different injuries, and he didn't have an offensive line that was healthy. Like, the left side of the offensive line was rotating, and you can make excuses, but the bottom line is, if you watch him, he's an elevator for the Jaguars. He elevates the players around him, and I think a lot of times when you see some of these mistakes happen, like the fumbles, the interceptions that are untimely, he is trying to do so much to put the team on his back. It's because he's had to, quite frankly. Like the 2022 run where they got crazy hot at the end of the season and made the playoffs, that was on Trevor Lawrence, right? That was him playing unbelievable football. They started 8-3 last year before the team started getting decimated by injuries. He was playing really damn good football. And you look at like EPA lost off of drops and receivers not being in the right place and offensive line play. It was awful for the Jaguars in 2023. So I definitely think that Trevor Lawrence, he's fully healthy now. We had our first OTA out there today where we were able to see him on the field. There's no braces. There's no nothing. He looks fully good to go. As long as he's able to stay healthy and the offensive line can protect him, I think that the Jaguars have a great chance to have a much better looking offense. And I also think another storyline that's probably gone a little under talked about, there's a good chance Doug Peterson retakes over the play calling duties in Jacksonville in 2024. He's hinted at it a couple times. He hasn't officially confirmed it. But the fact that he's even acknowledged that it's a possibility kind of probably suggests to me that they're heading in a direction where he's a lot more hands-on with the offense than he was in 2023.
I think there was a notable difference in 2022 and 2023 when it comes to the play calling. And kind of just to build off your talk about the offensive line, something that has interested me is like Cam Robinson is, I believe, in the last year of his deal. Do you think he is an extension candidate, or what is kind of the succession plan that you see at that position?
That's a great question, because not only is Cam Robinson in the final year of his deal, Walker Little, who is their swing tackle right now, is also in the final year of his rookie deal. Now, they did draft Javon Foster in the 4th round. If I'm drafting an offensive tackle in the 4th round, am I betting on him being my starter the next year?
Probably not.
Probably not. So my guess is that one of Cam Robinson or Walker Little is still in Jacksonville on a new deal following the 2024 season. Whether it's Cam or Walker Little, I'm not sure. Cam Robinson is a more expensive player just because he started a ton of games. He's a guy that has more recognition. You could, call back to more tape. But when Walker Little has had to fill in for Cam Robinson, which he has quite a bit, he's been good. So I think either way, you feel pretty good about the future of the tackle position. And they could also just say, hey, we're going to draft another one in the first round next year. They did that with Anton Harrison last year, plugged him right into the starting lineup, had a really good year protecting Trevor Lawrence. So we'll see how it plays out. But if I had to guess, I would say one of Cam Robinson or Walker Little would be back in 2025.
And also, I just wanted to throw in a little, just going back here a couple minutes when we were still on the Trevor Lawrence thing. That's how I had to say, because it's so true also. Like, before I get to my next question, a lot of people, I know because you're a Jags fan, and people really tuned in and paying attention, they know. But that receiving core so many times last year was doing Trevor Lawrence no favors in terms of, I think there's about a 4 minute, I'm not even kidding, there's like a 4 or 5 minute video you can watch of just drops from the receiving core last year. And if every single one of those drops was caught where it was perfect ball placement, great ball, you'd add an extra 400 or 500 yards on his total at the end of the season. So things like that, that a lot of the populace just doesn't consider. It's stuff like that you got to pay attention to. And real fans that were paying attention know Trevor Lawrence, there's just not a lot of favors being done from the rest of the offense to him, as you've already pointed out from last year. But to transition into a next question, I think you'll like this one, because this one will definitely, it gives you a lot of options. What Jaguar would you pin to make the biggest leap in the 2024-2025 season?
A great question. It might be funny to say this because he had 10 sacks last year, but Trayvon Walker, I don't think he was as consistent as he wants to be or as he needs to be. I think that the fact that you have Eric Armstead coming in to help in the middle, the fact that you have Trayvon Walker going into year 3, who everyone that watched him in college knew as a pass rusher, he was a project, even though he was the first overall pick. He was a guy who needed to develop as a pass rusher. Very good run defender, freak athlete, strong as anyone out there. But from a pass rush standpoint, he needed to develop. You saw him do a little bit of developing in year 1. I think he took a good step forward in year 2. But in year 3, if he can really start to put it all together, again, Josh Allen on the other side, Eric Armstead in the middle, maybe a healthy Devon Hamilton, and then your new defensive coordinator, Ryan Nielsen, is a defensive line guru. He cut his teeth in the NFL and then coaching, and as a player, as a defensive line guy. So I think there's a chance Trayvon Walker kind of explodes onto the scene instead of just like has a good 10 sack year. I think there's a chance he makes a Pro Bowl in 2024.
Well, that would certainly be a welcome sight for all Jags fans. And and I like that answer because, to your point, he definitely ascended a lot from that rookie year. But you just want to see that technique become a little bit more, polished. You want to see him really making more of an impact consistently. But I'm with you. Yeah, he has all the tools. We knew that, like you said, from when he got drafted, he has all the tools. Just about honing them out. And I think with Nielsen, he is in a great situation now. So I definitely like that answer. I think, we're going to definitely have to keep an eye on Trayvon Walker. If he could push 13, 14 sacks this year, to your point, I would not be too surprised because of how much help he's going to have as well. That unit is going to be ferocious if they can all stay healthy.
Absolutely.
Sort of an insignificant question, but it could be a big player depending on, we never know how the season's going to go. Just going through a couple tweets, I could tell you're a little bit lukewarm on it, didn't really care for it. How did you feel about the Mac Jones trade when it happened? Like, were you just surprised, like what is Balky doing, or was it like we need not a succession, but a backup plan? As we've seen, teams have invested more money in backups because the reality is, if your starting quarterback goes down, hopefully your season's not over.
Right. Yeah, and for most teams it would be. At first, I was definitely like, "What are we doing?" I remember I was at my buddy's his 1-year-old's first birthday party, and we were all just like, "What hell is going on right now?" But when you take a step back, he's going into the final year of his rookie deal. He probably is more talented than just about every backup in the league. And there's a good chance that if he has a good preseason, you might be able to get a comp pick for him next year if he signs somewhere else. Because the way the quarterback comp pick formula works, it's really really easy to get a comp pick when a quarterback signs elsewhere, as long as you don't go crazy spending yourself. So I think there's a decent chance that they're just kind of like, well, this guy might be an upgrade over CJ Beathard. Heck, we might need 3 quarterbacks because CJ Beathard was playing through an injury at the end of last season when he was filling in for Trevor Lawrence. So they really were kind of in a bad way with the injuries at quarterback last year. So I think that trading a 6th-round pick for him, I think he's going to end up being the backup. I think that CJ Beathard, they'll probably try to stash on the practice squad if I had to guess. But yeah, I think they're just thinking, let's have some insurance, some good insurance, and maybe we'll get something out of it following the 2024 season.
Well, to me, I mean, the reality to me is, unless you don't know ball, like you were saying earlier, the Patriots really weren't doing him much on offense. I mean, they had Matt Patricia calling plays for him, and the wide receiver core was brutal. He had 3,800 yards his rookie year. I think Mac Jones was just destroyed mentally in a franchise where he was expected to replace one of the best, if not the best, quarterback of all time. And just like the guy replacing Nick Saban at Alabama, it's usually never a recipe for success. And I still think Mac Jones could have success in the league put into the right system. And I do think, barring an injury, hopefully not, that he can come in and win some games for the Jaguars if Trevor Lawrence were to go down. I still think there's a reason he was taken in the first round, and there was a reason he had such a successful rookie year.
And it's also a great point about the comp pick. It's like stuff that you don't think about necessarily like right when you hear the news. But then, like you said, when you break it down and think about it, that's a very good point about the comp pick as well that I really didn't even consider up to this point.
Yeah, so, and he's a guy from Jacksonville. I don't know if y'all knew that.
Yeah.
He is from Duval. So he's happy to return home, get a fresh start, kind of, get the stink of New England off and hopefully rehab his career a little bit. I think that everybody involved kind of knows there's a good chance that it's only like a 1-year situation. But it could be a good situation for everyone.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So to transition into the next question here, what would you say is the ceiling and then also simultaneously what would be the floor for the Jaguars this year?
Great question. I guess I would say the ceiling would be to go to the AFC Championship. That's if a lot of the bets they make hit. I can't pick anybody to beat the Chiefs. But, I think that there's a good chance that the Jaguars are one of the better teams in the AFC. I still have Houston in front of them in their own division, though, at this point in the offseason. I think that they did a little bit of a better job to just support what they had going on. And it's funny, like Houston was kind of in the position this offseason that the Jaguars were in last offseason. But I think Houston did a lot more to capitalize on what they could do to improve their team than the Jaguars did last offseason. So I still have the Texans in front of them, but I think the Jaguars, in a perfect scenario, could make the AFC Championship game. They have Ryan Nielsen, who did a fantastic job in Atlanta with the Falcons last year as their defensive coordinator, got them to be one of the better third down defenses, one of the better red zone defenses. He has a lot of talent. I still think they could use another corner. But a lot of talent overall on defense. I think that the offense, if Doug Peterson again gets more hands-on this year than he was last year, and there's a little bit more injury luck, you're looking at a very good football team overall. But I can't pick them to beat the Chiefs in the playoffs. But the floor is interesting. I would say I don't think the floor is super low. I think maybe 7 wins. Something like that, where like they're competing towards the end of the season, but they don't quite make the playoffs. Maybe if they have really bad injury luck again, that could happen. But overall, when you look at the roster, you look at the makeup of the coaching staff, this is it's a pretty damn good team overall. I don't think it's a championship team, but I think it's a playoff team, and it would be surprising if they're not close to the playoffs.
I think that's a perfectly level-headed way to look at it. And I was thinking basically about the same for the ceiling and the floor. So I think, you're looking at it probably about as level-headed as you could. And to your point, though, also, if they could somehow make a run to the Lombardi, you guys would be ecstatic. And it's not like it's impossible.
No
It's
doubt.
just it's not like as likely with the way the roster is built right now. But you guys, to the point, me and Hunter last year were on the train of for a long time until the injury started happening.
The hot
We were like, hey,
Jags.
we were on team. We were saying Jags 1 seed, Jags 1 seed. So we have faith in you guys. And again, to your point, they've just done more building this offseason. If they can just stay healthy, the Jaguars are for sure a threat. There's no doubt about that.
When they started folding in the middle of the year, it was like crushing. I was riding for. We all try to have, like, when me and Dobbs, when we go into a season, we all try to have narratives that we just ride through the year. Like, this is what we think will happen. And I had the Jags 1 seed at the beginning. It was looking real good, and then they started folding, and it was just brutal to watch. But kind of going into that, as we've seen the Jaguars throughout the last couple of years. It definitely changed from like the 2017 when they made that run. What is your favorite Jaguars memory as a fan?
There's a lot. I mean, if you want to just go back to 2022, like they had to clinch against the Titans. That was the AFC South de facto title game, in Week 18. And Josh Allen had to get a strip sack at the end to help win the game. And or actually, he returned a strip sack for a touchdown, which was just insane. But probably like the most Jaguars, most Duval thing was 2017 season. Seahawks are in town in December. That was back when they were still like, on top of the world type of Seahawks. Legion of Boom still going on a little bit. But Quentin Jefferson tries to crawl into the stands to fight some of the fans. And he gets kicked out, of course, and everything. But fans enticing or egging on a guy so much that he feels like he needs to crawl into the stands. That was pretty awesome.
I mean, like, I think the Jaguars have left us with a lot of moments. I remember I was at a bar in Chicago watching the Jags-Chargers game, and I was with I'm a big T-Law guy. Like, I like Herbert, but I just think T-Law kind of has that, like, resiliency sometimes, like kind of that X factor in big games that he knows how to take care of things. And they
he
go
has a little bit more effort too.
Yeah.
Like let's just go for it. Let's go.
My favorite moment was when they come back. I've been quiet all day in the group chat, and my friend's talking big shit, big Herbert guy, Tyler. It was Tyler. You remember, Dobbs. And he
I remember this day vividly still.
He was just mute. There's nothing to say. I mean, it was just one of the most fun games I have ever watched. And just, this is usually our last question, but I have something else just because, the Jags, to me, have some of the coolest uniforms in the NFL. What is your favorite Jags uniform that they wear? Because I really like the old, like, vintage ones when, like, Maurice Jones-Drew used to play.
Yeah, no question. And they're bringing the throwbacks back this year. Or, like, not back. It's the first time they're ever doing throwbacks. They're doing them this year. The ones where, when Maurice Jones-Drew was a young player, Fred Taylor, Jimmy Smith, Mark Brunell, Tony Baselli, those throwbacks, those are the best uniforms by far, in my opinion. I love those. Pretty much every jersey I buy now, if I'm going to get a jersey, it's going to be a throwback. So really excited to see those this year.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jordan. We appreciate it. Do you want to let people know where they can find you?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Jordan DeLugo. You can also check out genjag.com or check out the GenJag YouTube channel or on whatever podcast platform of choice if you want more Jags coverage. And if you're just interested in like NFL draft and NFL topics at large, I also have Rogue Football where I dive deep into, draft fits, prospect profiles, lots of fun stuff on the draft and the NFL at large. So, yeah, really appreciate you guys having me on.
Of course. Yeah, as always, if you don't know ball, want to know ball, be sure to subscribe. Leave a like. Let us know in the comments what you think the Jaguars' record will be this year. All of Jordan's info will be in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great rest of your night.